So it's officially been 1 full year since Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis launched, and to celebrate the game's 1-year anniversary, the developers, including Tetsuya Nomura, sat down to tease all of the upcoming content for this game, including the upcoming chapter for the first soldier, which is going to focus more on young Sephiroth, and there may be a character from Crisis Core popping up in that chapter. No, I am not talking about Angeal, but we will get to that later in the video. They also tease the secrets of the Masamune, Sephiroth's main weapon, how he gets it, and how there might be more to that weapon than it just being a regular sword. And surprisingly enough, one of the developers also gives us a time frame on when we will be getting information on 7 Remake Part 3, which is pretty nuts. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around and help out support the channel, you can subscribe, leave a comment, and smash the bell notification with an octaslash to stay up to date with all of my uploads. So this interview comes to us directly from Famitsu, where they sat down with Tetsuya Nomura, who is the creative director for Ever Crisis, Motomu Toriyama, who is the game's director, and Shoichi Ichikawa, who is the game's producer. And they're celebrating Ever Crisis because it's been 1 official full year since the game's launch, which seems pretty nuts. It kind of feels like it just came out yesterday. And I did play a decent amount of it, but I hit that wall and I just didn't want to grind anymore or put any of my own money into the game to get further. But thankfully, a lot of the story stuff, which has been incredibly interesting, has been made available online through a lot of different people. So we've been able to take a look at that, investigate it, and kind of come to some pretty cool conclusions on where they're going with the story, because it's connecting, surprisingly enough, to the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, which is pretty sick. Now, before we dive into all of the teases for the story stuff, they are doing a lot of cool stuff with the outfits, including giving all of the characters Bahamut garbs. And the characters look pretty sick in the artwork. You got Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, and Yuffie, all in their own Bahamut gear. And I'm crossing my fingers that for 7 Remake Part 3, they give us a ton of cool costumes. It's going to be the last game in the franchise. Let's go out with a bang. Give us some cool outfits that we can use on New Game Plus, like these Bahamut outfits, maybe some Advent Children stuff, maybe the Kingdom Hearts stuff for Cloud and Sephiroth. And heck, maybe even some brand new original pieces. It all looks pretty sick, and I hope we get that on Remake Part 3. Now, starting up first, they mention Glenn, who has a pretty big role to play in this story. Famitsu goes on to say, Glenn appeared in 7 Rebirth, but he was also quite different. Will the circumstances that led to Glenn becoming like that be depicted in the future? Toriyama responds by saying it may be depicted somewhere, but that's a little further down the line. Now, Glenn is a really interesting character. I've pretty much loved most of what they've done with him in Ever Crisis. I think the writing has been really great for him, and he seemed like such a fun, kind of lighthearted, almost kind of himbo-ish in a way kind of character. And then we saw him pop up in Rebirth, and he was the opposite of that. He was dark, menacing, kind of spoke in riddles sometimes. He was disheveled. Something was just off. And we do learn at the end of Rebirth that that Glenn we're seeing is not the real Glenn. Unfortunately, at some point in this first soldier storyline, Rufus catches up to Glenn and just straight up assassinates him, which is unfortunate. And the Glenn we've been seeing in Rebirth is some sort of weird manifestation of Sephiroth and Genova messing with Rufus, essentially manipulating him into getting into this war with Wutai, among other things. So sadly, the real Glenn is dead, and I want to bring up this little theory that someone brought up on my channel that is incredibly disturbing and really sad. But if you remember from the first soldier stuff we covered a while ago, there was the character of Rosen, who was kind of becoming friends with Sephiroth, and he also happened to have a dog by the name of Refu. Well, after Rosen dies, Glenn ends up adopting Refu. We know that Glenn dies, and there is a theory that Rufus takes Refu, or Rifu, depending on your level of literacy, and potentially has Hojo experiment on him, turning him into Darkstar, the dog we see in 7 Remake and 7 Rebirth when Cloud is fighting Rufus. They even have similar markings, I guess, on their forehead. Now, if that ends up being the case, holy shit, that is twisted. And as an animal person, even if it's a fictional animal, I can't help but be kind of sad. That's just a big bummer if that ends up being true, and if it is, we will eventually learn about it in this story, but that's pretty twisted. Up next, Famitsu talks about how the ending of the first chapter of The First Soldier was a bit of a bummer. So what's coming next for these characters? Toriyama responds by saying the story we're going to depict is set in a timeline that's been around for less than a year since young Sephiroth finished his mission with Glenn and the others. The spotlight will be on young Sephiroth, who will visit a certain area in Wutai, where Angeal will join him as a colleague. The story will depict Sephiroth and Angeal, as well as other characters, and will depict Sephiroth's further growth. Which, again, they gave us a pretty brief teaser at the end of The First Soldier Chapter 1, where we see young Sephiroth walking with young Angeal. They're also being documented by some dude with a camera who some people are saying might be Snaps from 7 Rebirth. He's been around for a while, he's a photographer. It would kind of make sense that maybe he's documenting the journey of this young hero who will become, you know, the great war hero Sephiroth. And of course, Angeal, one of Sephiroth's closest friends, will also be there. And here's where Famitsu and a lot of us are on the same wavelength. They continue by saying, Sephiroth and Angeal. Will Genesis also be involved? Nomura responds by saying, that's a secret, and proceeds to laugh. I'm pretty sure that means yeah. You have to have Genesis, whether you like him or you hate him. I tend to lead more towards the latter. He wasn't that great of a character in Crisis Core. The idea of Genesis I thought was incredibly interesting. Unfortunately, his execution as a character, not so much. He was pretty robotic. He was so obsessed with Loveless, which, look, after playing through 7 Rebirth, I get it. Loveless was an incredible play. I thought it was incredibly interesting, and I'm infatuated, but you can't just go around spouting off Loveless quotes and make that your personality. So I'm pretty sure that means, yeah, Genesis is going to be in this story, and it will be young Genesis. And what's really cool is that the writing for the Ever Crisis stuff in Sephiroth in The First Soldier has been really, really good. It's been on par with the writing in the 7 Remake trilogy, which I think has been phenomenal. And by bringing Genesis and Angeal back, you now basically get a do-over to write these characters better, flesh them out more, give them more of a personality. Because in Crisis Core, Angeal was kind of boring. He was a bit dull, and it was the same with Genesis. Angeal essentially was there to be a mentor to Zack and to pass off the Buster Sword to him. Now, Zack does carry some stuff from Angeal with him, but it's the, you know, basic stuff you would come to expect, like protecting your honor as a soldier. There's also the legacy of the Buster Sword, which we will get into very shortly. And then, of course, Genesis was a loveless machine. And unfortunately, we didn't really get to see that friendship between those 3 characters of Sephiroth, Angeal, and Genesis in Crisis Core. They were already established friends, but most of what we saw between them was Genesis and Sephiroth kind of butting heads with one another, and Angeal needing to step in to control the chaos. So it was very much that angsty Genesis who wanted to one-up Sephiroth. So hopefully with the First Soldier story, they can really find a way to flesh these characters out, make me understand why they're so close and what they mean to each other. And again, with this being a do-over with better writing, I think they'll do that, and I'm incredibly excited to see how they make us hopefully either come to like these characters a lot and understand them, or potentially even love them, because there's a chance Angeal and Genesis will show up in Remake Part 3 in some capacity, which I'm all for. And Ichikawa does kind of reassure some of my fears by saying, I think the inner workings of the young Sephiroth will continue to be one of the points of interest in the story. I think the relationship between Sephiroth and Angeal will also be a highlight, and of course, Angeal will be playable. So for those of you who like playing Ever Crisis, you're now going to get your hands on Angeal, and of course, I would expect Genesis at some point. Now up next, Famitsu brings up the relationship between Angeal and his Buster Sword. Obviously, there is a legacy there that gets passed on to Zack, who then passes it on to Cloud. So even though Cloud never meets Angeal, technically a lot of the beliefs that Angeal held, his experiences with that Buster Sword, which he didn't use all that often, is still technically with Cloud, whether he realizes it or not. That was stuff that Zack just kind of passed on to him. You're literally my living legacy is what Cloud says, and it's not just a metaphorical thing, it's a physical thing, because Cloud is wielding that Buster Sword, which carries literal and metaphorical weight. And they bring that up because apparently, and this is something we kind of briefly touched on months ago, they're going to be doing the same for Sephiroth in his main weapon, the Masamune. Nomura goes on to say, as for Masamune, I was actually consulted about how to handle him in 7 Rebirth. It would be unnatural to have him in the open all the time while moving around the field, and he couldn't carry it on his back like Cloud. So we were like, what should we do? And this is all in reference to a lot of times when you see Sephiroth in Rebirth, he doesn't have his Masamune. It's only when he's getting ready to fight, it just suddenly shows up, and then outside of battle, it disappears. And you can chalk that up to just being like a video game thing where you're suspending your disbelief, where someone's weapon or item or material or whatnot that they have just kind of disappears. It's like when Cloud grabs an item and then just kind of places it behind his back and it's gone. It's clearly in his inventory, we just don't see it. Famitsu continues to point out that at the beginning of Rebirth with the Nibelheim stuff, we don't see Sephiroth with the Masamune until he's about to enter battle. Nomura continues by saying, that's right, at that time I told the 7 Rebirth team members Masamune actually has a secret, and that mystery will be revealed in Ever Crisis, so I want you to proceed in that form without the Masamune in the field. Toriyama then says, I also plan to draw a reason for the depiction of Masamune disappearing when moving on the field but appearing in battle. More specifically, there is also an episode about how Masamune was created and why Sephiroth ended up obtaining it. And this to me is cool. This might, for some people, kind of seem like it's unnecessary backstory that you're adding to Sephiroth's weapon. Like, why is it important? He's this big bad who's super cool and happens to have, you know, a really extra long sword that he uses in battle. That alone would be enough. It's Sephiroth. He needs an intimidating weapon to go along with his intimidation factor. But I'm curious to see what they do with Masamune. Like, how does he obtain this massive weapon that becomes his signature? But also, how is it disappearing and reappearing? And clearly it's not just a game thing. They're putting thought into that reason, into that little thing that we keep noticing, like one minute he's got it, the next he doesn't. So is the Masamune this weapon that is, you know, this supernatural being that just kind of works along Sephiroth that can appear and reappear whenever he needs it? And on top of that, who makes this weapon for Sephiroth? This is something he gets in Wutai, which would make sense. Maybe he befriends somebody in Wutai, maybe there's somebody that's held captive, maybe they've got a blacksmith, and for whatever reason they make this weapon for Sephiroth. I think that's incredibly intriguing. And again, when it comes to the 7 Remake trilogy and what they're doing with Ever Crisis, the developers aren't just doing things just to do things. They really are thinking all of this stuff through, down to every minute detail. So whatever they're planning with Sephiroth and the Masamune is going to be important, and hopefully it will make sense. And it'll probably be something that gets referenced in Remake Part 3, which is pretty exciting to see. And it's another story thing that just kind of adds to Sephiroth and Cloud. Cloud with that legacy of the Buster Sword, and now Sephiroth is going to have his legacy with his Masamune. Now, speaking of Remake Part 3, this is towards the end of the article as the developers are giving their final words on what they can look forward to the fans. Toriyama responds by saying this: although we have just celebrated the first anniversary, the planning team has already started talking about the second anniversary. He laughs. We are considering various things, such as what the next motif should be. We hope you will enjoy the next anniversary, and by that time, information about the final work of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project may start to come out. So we hope you will get excited together. Now that to me is a pretty big drop, teasing that somewhere towards the end of 2025 is when Remake Part 3's information is going to start to get the ball rolling. And that's what I had kind of speculated. If they're aiming for a 2027 release window, then realistically they would have to start getting some information out by the end of 2025 or early 2026 to help build up hype and anticipation, because 2026 is going to be the game's essentially coming out year, where you're going to have a bunch of big events that are going to be kicked off by the Game Awards at the end of 2025, which is going to be in December. So if they wanted to, Square could drop some sort of teaser at the 2025 Game Awards to kind of whet people's appetite. Sometime early 2026, there could be a state of play dedicated to it. Again, Jeff Keighley has his Summer Game Fest, so I wouldn't be shocked if he gets another exclusive for Remake Part 3 during the summer of 2026. And then, of course, the usual suspects of Tokyo Game Show, the following Game Awards and whatever events Square wants to hold specifically for Remake Part 3. And then of course, we still need the name. A lot of us are thinking it's going to be Final Fantasy VII Return, based on Rebirth's soundtrack and its connection to Sephiroth and the titles of his songs. So that makes a lot of sense, but either way, the fact that he gave us a time frame of when that information could hit is pretty big. And again, the fact that the development team for the 7 Remake project have willingly given out information on Part 3 in the same year where Rebirth came out is pretty exciting. None of us thought they would do that, and they're doing that. So they're definitely getting all of us hyped up for that next part of the trilogy, the finale, and I cannot wait to see what they do. So with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of the news from this Famitsu article? Do you think Genesis will show up? Are you excited for that? And what do you think they're going to do with this Masamune stuff? What's going to be the backstory for the Masamune, how Sephiroth gets it, and why it keeps appearing and reappearing? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.